Hey everyone, what's going on? It's Arn here from Evenant, and in this video I want to do a quick breakdown of a track that I wrote 3 or so months ago that's doing pretty well in terms of licensing, and I thought I might do a little breakdown, look at some of the elements, look at some of the structure, some of the production things in here. So hopefully there's some kind of value and some things you can learn from it if you're writing music for, commercials, TV, licensing, stuff like that. So this track was written fairly quickly, and it stemmed from a little improvisation session with my guitar and some new pedals that I'd acquired at that time. And when I'm working on these tracks, I tend to work fairly fast and try to flesh out the idea as quickly as possible. And I am pretty sure this track was done in a couple of days. I usually like to let my ears rest a little bit in between starting and finishing a track, and there are quite a few tracks in this project, but it's not nearly as intimidating as it might look. So to kick things off, why not just listen through the track and then we'll start looking at the details. So I got both the master here, the stems, and then my unmastered project file, so we can go get a little bit more granular. So let's start listening through the master and then dive in. you get the idea. So this is a track that is almost 5 minutes long, and let's just start by looking at the kind of overarching structure of this composition. So when writing these tracks, I'm keeping the format and kind of the target audience, or like the target using, like the usage of the track in mind as I'm composing, as I'm structuring things. So this is not for trailers, this is not for films, this is not a composition for just listening. This is a track that is written for licensing, and a fairly specific type of licensing as well in mind. Mostly for brands and commercials, as well as content creators and YouTubers. So we're talking about everything from photographers and time lapses to wedding videos to motivational videos on YouTube to brands and commercials and so on. So I'm keeping that in mind and knowing the kind of music that is being used there, and the kind of parts that is required in order to make this a very helpful toolkit for video editors and video creators and brands in order to use it for their videos. So you can see that I have a build here in the beginning, and another thing that I can mention in regards to structure, when I'm composing, I'm liking to have a track that is showing me the structure and the different parts at any time, and like color coding them just to make everything a bit easier, because there's like probably 120 or so individual tracks in here after I'm doing all the different string recordings and so on. So it just helps to have something very tangible to kind of see what is where, and if I need to move something around, I can just go like this and I have selected everything, and I know I'll get everything inside that track section. So that's just a little part of my workflow that I'm enjoying, that I think is fairly helpful, at least for me. So it's something to worth thinking about. Now, the first kind of part of the track is a build that goes until this part here, and it's all based around one chord progression. So this composition is very simple. It's all based around this one chord progression that kind of has the melody built into the chords. Then we have a little break before we get the final build where the drums come in, and it's starting to really become more of a drastic build that rapidly increases in energy before we get to the back end, the climax of the track, where we just kind of throw everything at the wall and try to make it sound as just grandiose and majestic as possible to fit really stunning visuals and the climax of the story that is being told, or if it's a time lapse or a video that has to do with nature photography and stuff, when the cuts start to get a little bit more intense and the biggest, most incredible shots are being unleashed to the viewer, basically. So I'm trying to create a few different parts that people can use for this. So we have say we're making a time-lapse video, or we're like a photographer, a traveling photographer or videographer. We have some stuff that is really good for intros, with very calm shots of the ocean and the sunrise and whatever. And then we have a build to keep progressing the video and storytelling. And I'm starting to introduce the strings. And then I'm kind of slowing down into this little break in between the sections. And when I'm creating these builds, one thing that I'm just keeping in mind is to make sure that no two sections like these that are the repetition of the chord progression is exactly the same in terms of the instrumentation and energy and so on. So if you listen to this, I've introduced some horns, which is flugelhorn recordings, or recording from myself actually. Yeah, I'm introducing a little bit more strings, more strings, and we'll look at the string arrangement and how it's kind of building in complexity in a little bit. But then I'm taking it all the way down to just the synths or the keys. So this again, sometimes there is a little bit of a pause or something that needs a little bit more of a calmer mood in those type of videos. Maybe there's a break where there's a bit of storytelling over something, talking a bit of context, or maybe it might be vlog style things. It all depends on the video. But my point is, if I didn't have this, the video editor would have to loop or cut in the intro, which could work, but it could also sound a little bit out of place and a little bit forced. So I like to give them a few calmer moments to play with in terms of the editing. So here we have 3 of them. And they're all different. I haven't just looped it exactly the same, because again, that would be a little bit lazy and it wouldn't really serve the video editor, because I want to give them as many puzzle pieces or tools to play with for their video as they're using this track. So second part of that is that everything I believe in arranging and in track structuring is about contrast, and I like to think about things in terms of contrast and growth. So of course you want your track to progress and grow, but in order for something to be perceived as, you know, massive or loud, you need a comparison, and your ears are always working by comparison, or I mean our minds in general. So in order to make this hit as hard as possible, it needs to be loud compared to something else, and the louder the preceding sections are, that is in recent memory of the listener, the less powerful this is going to be perceived. So that's another reason why after I have built things to a certain level when it comes to these kind of tracks, I like to take things down all the way as low as possible. And as you see here, it's like almost silent before we get to this build, where you feel like everything is just opening up. And then here, next round, we get even more elements, more drums, and it's just building and building and building. And then as you see here, there's a little break right in between. And there's a reason for that. And the main one is that it's all about contrast again, and we want to create a toolkit again that's easy to edit with. So the video editor might want a transition that highlights this massive reveal or moment. So I've been giving him or her that in terms of this little break. And if I'm moving this right here, you can hear that this is almost lower in volume compared to the final moment here. So if we're going straight into it, it's going to lose a lot of energy and it's not going to hit as hard. It's not the same kind of release as if we're having this little break in between. So these little breaks that just kind of suck you into the next section is very, very effective. So these little breaks are really effective. That's just some of the overarching kind of larger development that's happening here and things that's worth keeping in mind. And then of course at the end, we're just throwing everything against the wall and trying to make it sound massive. Then in final end, the drums are picking up. again, trying to just give different variations to play with for the video creator or the brand that's working with this song in order to create that larger than life moment, hopefully. So that's kind of like some of the goals when it comes to the structure and some of the thought processes that's happening as I'm writing this, because I'm just starting with one loop. And to look at where this track started, it was all with one guitar recording. I believe it's this one. This is the original one, where I had created a little bit of a loop. I think this is all one take that I've been cutting together into something that makes sense. I was using this granular looping pedal that I got from Chase Bliss Audio called Mood, and I was playing with various textures. You can hear this looping. And I was cutting together different parts of it. And it's just looping this throughout the whole track basically in the background. And then over that I started playing around with some guitars and some piano and so on. So let's have a look at some of the individual elements. I think first maybe just look at the stems, because it's a little bit more structured and less elements to pay attention to. So it's starting just with the keys and this texture. And then I'm introducing this flugelhorn, keeping it evolving for each section. In the background got these textures, which is Exosphere textures mixed with guitar. So Exosphere is a pack that me and Josh created. We've been collaborating on pretty much all of these tracks. And we create samples from the elements we're using the most to kind of flesh out these songs, get them finished, and to get us inspired and give us the tools we need to help create these tracks as quickly as possible. So we have the effects, some basic booms, and then I created some reversed kind of tonal swells with my guitar. And they're really helping kind of add more atmosphere and depth to the transitions. If I take it out, it's helping us just propel into the next section. So actually this exact sound is in our new sound pack called Kronos that you can check out in the description below, which has over 100 and something different tonal swells and textures and transitions like this. Again, made to help us flesh out these tracks quickly and add more depth and character to everything. Then moving on. At this point we're introducing the strings. So here we got the brass introduced, here we have the strings introduced, as well as a synth bass. Strings come in with a melody. And the swells in the whooshes in the effect stem are getting bigger as well to give more energy. And in this part as well, I'm actually introducing more guitar elements. We got this guitar ostinato. And the strings are going up an octave and just growing and evolving. So There's two things that I just want to mention here as little observations. We're both increasing the dynamics and the energy of the arrangement as a whole, both in each individual layer, but also in the amount of layers. So it starts out with just keys and the effects and the background texture. So very simple, just the chords. And then the second repetition, we got this texture coming in just as a swell, a transition. But we got the flugelhorn. And then this repetition, strings are playing very sparse. And then together coming in with a bass. In the next section, a melody comes in the strings. So that's helping everything evolve a little bit. Then we got a guitar sonata in the next repetition coming in. And the next one after there, we got both synths and a higher octave coming into the strings. So in a way, I kind of like to make sure that no element or no stem is simply just repeating and looking the same over and over. So even the effect stems are not just the same boom over and over. As it's growing, we're adding more whooshes and increasing the energy. And this is the break, so it's just back to the boom. And then you see the effects and the hits are getting bigger and bigger. Similarly, if we're looking at the brass and string stems, that's also evolving, not just looping the same thing. The synths are coming in and out. And each element is actually growing and evolving. If you look at the guitars, it's just starting with a tonal transition, and then we get the ostinatos coming in. In the next section, we got big chords. So each element is growing and evolving, as well as the whole arrangement in total. So that's something to keep in mind as well, to not only add more elements, but look at both how you can increase the energy of each element, but also the playing style. If you're working with live musicians, this is easy. If not, I would like to keep it in mind when you're working with virtual libraries as well. It's kind of helpful to think of it as an instrumentalist still. And two of the main ways that you can increase the intensity of the performance is by using velocity. So if you have a piano loop and you want to loop it, maybe tweak it a little bit, but also increase the velocity for each repetition. So it's like playing harder and harder, or use the modulation wheel if that's the way to control the intensity of the performance. So that are some of the kind of big picture developments that's happening here. Again, I've gone over the mid section where we're just dropping back out to the kind of original ensemble, just textures and keys and the booms, and then we have those guitar transitions again. But again, I haven't just looped what was in the beginning. It's all individual performances on my analog synth, so nothing is really just looped or repeated. It's always evolving a little bit, and personally I think that makes a big difference. It makes the track feel a little bit more alive, makes things feel less looped. Making things feel too looped is a common issue that a lot of people report and that I hear in tracks, so that's worth keeping in mind, trying to spice it up for each repetition and making sure everything is always kind of changing like a real performance would. Now, I need to just mention that pretty much all of these elements are actually played live, except for the string mock-ups and maybe a couple of other things, but most of it is analog synth played live on the synth. I've played the flugelhorn textures live, that is sampled from my own playing, and it's both analog synths and live guitar. And the drums are tracked live, so it's not a sample library, but it's me actually chopping some of the loops from Exosphere. So if you listen to the drums on their own, they might not sound that incredible because it's all chopped up by me. But in context, it really works. So if I want to go into some of these takes just to show you exactly what I've done. See if we can find the drums in here somewhere. So this is the big back end. You can see that I have been cutting and pasting and adding in one shots, and you see all of it is basically from Exosphere. Let me make sure this group is on. So using actual live recordings and samples also helps contribute to a bit more of a live feeling. So whenever possible, that's also something I personally recommend and really enjoy doing. So that's some of the things that's been helping me when writing these songs, thinking of the individual developments as well as the track as a whole. Because when they both come together, things become quite effective. Another thing is that I have left out a lot of elements towards the very end, like the biggest moments, like these big synths. So that they become more effective when they're actually used. And that's another thing that's worth keeping in mind. Like if you got big synths or big brass instruments, it's usually a good idea to kind of save them for the biggest moments, because once you've used them, you've kind of hit a little bit of a ceiling for how far you can go. So again, I'm a big believer in contrast and dynamics, and keeping that in mind as you're writing. So saving things for the big moments usually help enhance those dynamics, again because your hearing and your ears hear things and how big it sounds in relation to what came before or previously. So if you're using these things sparingly, they often become more effective. Let's look at some of the individual elements, like the strings, for example. Again, you can see this is done pretty quickly. I haven't even quantized the MIDI, it's all just been played in live. And in the beginning, I just got some of these little string swells before we get a very sparse string arrangement of the main chords. So, as you hear, this is not a perfect mock-up. There's a lot of things that I could fix in here, now that I'm listening to it in isolation. But as a whole, it really works quite well, and I think some of the imperfections sometimes can make it sound a bit more alive, as long as it doesn't make it sound like an amateur orchestra. But here I got one repetition, then the violins are coming in, doubling the octave of the melody, and then more violins are coming and making it sound even bigger. And we got the counter melody in the cello. And then the final moment, we got probably 3 octaves or so in here, and a counter melody in the cello. So we're both increasing the energy of the individual performances. Like we can see if we're going into the modulation, you can see they're starting quite soft and then getting bigger and bigger swells towards the end, and that's going for all of these instruments. But we're also increasing the kind of vertical we're increasing the energy vertically as well by adding more and more voices and octaves in the higher ranges, which is going to increase the energy of the arrangement. But we're also adding in more complexity by adding in more layers and just more complex movements, like this counter melody line in the cello. So we got that in the strings, and then in addition we have these movements that's occurring in the guitars. So at this point we're introducing a little bit of an ostinato in the guitars, as well as these counter movements in the strings. So we got two new elements coming in. So that's another thing I want to mention, that when you want your tracks to kind of grow and evolve, you can do that through both the energy, as we talked about, both internally in the track and is in the arrangement as a whole, and by adding more elements and reinforcing what's already there. But you can also add in additional layers, like an ostinato, like a counter melody, and things like that, or a rhythm. So those are also elements I'm using to kind of keep this growing and evolving for each round. And then again, when you want things to kind of go back a step and make things sound bigger and better and more complex in contrast, I'm taking the energy level down in this midsection, but I'm also removing all of the layers and reducing it down to just the chords / the melody again. So we're taking the complexity down to something very minimal again, so that when we're introducing the next section here, I'm reintroducing the energy of the synths, the strings, the keys, guitars, and so on. But as you can hear, it's still very simple because I haven't introduced any rhythms, counter melodies, ostinatos, or anything yet. It's mostly just this floating melody that works really well for grandiose, just slow images. So that's something I've kept in mind here. And then after that first repetition, I'm introducing the drums and more kind of counter movements or rhythm movements in the chords and the synths here. I meant the guitars, and then the synths come in the next section here. And again here at the end, I'm trying to build it up as big as I can towards the end, just really ramping up the energy, as you see in all the stems, and then having a complete break, and then the biggest section. So throughout this section, I'm starting bringing in all the elements, so I'm increasing the energy, but I'm still keeping the complexity fairly low, and just focusing on the main chords. And then I'm slowly increasing the complexity and the amount of elements coming in this build up for each repetition, then leading us into the back end where we have kind of everything just happening, but still most elements focusing on the same key elements, which is the chords and the melody. So if we're listening to the guitars and say the strings and the synths, they're all almost going to be playing the same thing if I'm not remembering wrong, because they're all outlining the same melody and chords. Then we got got the bass synth that's just reinforcing the low end. And as you can hear, there's a lot of elements going on. You can see there's 100 plus tracks in here. So I see I got acoustic guitars. I forgot to add in the electric, and they're also reinforcing the melodies, just drenched in reverb and delay. So I got the guitars reinforcing the chords, and I've got them really drenched in reverb and with a lot of overdrive playing the melody. So it's just like this wash in the background that's reinforcing the melody. And as a result, even though there's a lot of elements, it doesn't sound too messy or muddy. And I've also, in the higher kind of washed out elements, made sure to remove some of the low end and the low mids to make sure it doesn't become too cluttered and too messy. But most of it, of what's going on here, is reinforcing the same stuff, like these acoustic guitar chords, the bass, the electric guitars, the strings, the synths, and you can see that I've actually taken out the keys here. And the reason for that is that adding this in here is just going to introduce mud without really contributing to anything. And that's not even the main, that's just a break. So it's not the low end here. These things, they're basically just going to be masked by everything else that's happening in the same area. And it's just going to introduce more mud and clutter in my mix. So I just wanted to get rid of anything that's not strictly needed. So all of these things add a bit of character to that section, and of course the drums are pretty necessary. So all of those together create that back end, and I made sure to line each stem or group of instruments up so that they're reinforcing the same things. I've also made sure to follow, you know, the basic rules of overtones, making sure that there's a lot of space in the low end with octaves for the bass, and then that the chords that I'm playing are actually aligning very well and not having too narrow voicings in the low end, which is going to introduce a lot of mud and make everything just unmixable. So those are some general considerations I've made. And then I've also side-chained some of the elements to the kick that's happening in this back end as well, just to make it pump a little bit more and cut through. So those are some of the general considerations that I've made while I was writing this song, and I just wanted to highlight, you know, a few lessons that you might or might not take away from it. But again, this is not by any means any kind of tutorial in like how to write this kind of music or write music in general or anything that's right or wrong. It's just some things that I did and that I like to do, and that seems to be working well for some of these tracks that's getting licensed quite a bit. So I just wanted to share that with you. And I think I'm going to leave it at that to kind of just keep it to a few key points that might be worth keeping in mind. So let's just quickly recap those to make sure that we remember them. And I'm trying to remember what I've been talking about as well today. So the first thing to keep in mind is to always keep things changing. So for each repetition, either change the initial performance a little bit or make it evolve in some kind of way. And for each repetition in the track, maybe think of anything that you can add in, for example, like I've done with the strings and that I've done with the ostinato and the electric guitars, or adding in a synth bass or some synth chords. It's never repeating the same thing twice, and it's going to make it more helpful for video editors as well, because you can always loop something that works like this. And that's another little tip as well. A good thing with these tracks when it comes to just like TV licensing and so on, see if you can loop your sections in the master file and make it sound smooth and seamless like this. That's a test I'm doing all the time with these tracks that Josh told me. See if you can loop these sections and make it sound seamless. If you can in the master file, you got a good track to work with in terms of videos. So you can always loop things, but you can't, as a video editor, add anything in there to make it evolve more, and you don't want it to feel stagnant. So that's the first thing that I think is worth keeping in mind, seeing what you can add and evolve. And the second thing is look at how you can evolve the individual performances and individual layers, like I've done with the strings. That's increasing in complexity and in terms of the energy and in terms of the vertical kind of voicings, adding more and more octaves to the melody. And then think about the dynamics. Make sure that you sometimes take a little break to reset the ears of the listener so that they're more ready to receive the bigger moments that's coming later, and making those bigger moments stand out. And think of any breaks that might enhance transitions to make sure that you're not losing energy, but it's actually feeling like a lift in energy, even though it isn't. It's an illusion. That's something else to keep in mind when it comes to media, trailers, everything really, where you need to have something that really punches and really cuts through and works with grandiose visuals. So I think those are some of the key things. And of course, when you're adding a lot of elements, really stay religious when it comes to the voicing, when it comes to the overtones, and making sure that your low end remains clean and that you're not adding in too many ideas at once. As you can hear in the back end here, it's all reinforcing the same stuff. So I believe in minimalism and simplicity and reinforcing the main things instead of just adding too many elements and too many ideas. So less is more. And even if you have a lot of tracks and a lot of different flavors, see if you can reinforce the main idea and make that stronger instead of having a lot of conflicting ideas that just makes everything sound muddy. And finally, try to think like a musician. So when you're playing, use velocity, the modulation wheel, and the way you're arranging everything to kind of mimic more the behavior of a live player. So hopefully there's something helpful in here, and I hope you enjoyed a little breakdown of this song, and I'll see you in the next video.